few issues perplex the military and strategists of past times as much as the issue of how to win. Of fighting. French adventurer and Admiral Jean de Bouet lived in the 15th century, developed an intriguing response for the Middle Ages. One had to remain to win a war. In defense, since the army attacked was constantly at disadvantage. Let's examine more closely. Examine what he meant by this and think about how this would affect Middle Eastern combat practically. Thousands of years. To show, let us first consider offense and defense in the 100 Years' War. On October 25, 1415, two sizable armies squared off on a recently plowed field close to the little town of Agincourt. After a long wait, the English advanced, dug in around 250 meters from the French line, and broke the uneasy silence with a hail of whizzing arrows. The French answer was swift. Their cavalry approached and charged the English line. However, in assaulting the opponent, they discovered a row of sharpened stakes the English archers had driven into the earth. Faced with strong fight from the English, they retreated back, putting the soldiers behind them into disarray. The approach paused and sank into disarray, giving the English archers time to unleash a devastating barrage of arrows. Shortly after the French infantry finally reached the English trenches, the two armies came to a stop. They struggled for the upper hand until the English archers on the flanks eventually rushed themselves into close combat and sealed the destiny of the French. Jean de Bay attributed the French defeat at Agincourt to the fact that the English took a solid stance and pushed the French to take the initiative by pelting them with arrows. They were compelled to either retreat or go on the tactical offensive and begin the lengthy march to the English lines. As we have seen, this was their undoing. Jean de Bay cites 6 other situations in which attacking armies suffered comparable difficulties, finding that a formation on foot should never march forward, but should always stand stationary and await its foes on foot. A force which marches before another force is defeated unless God allows it grace, and therefore, take up a position as beneficial as possible and do it early. In addition to de Bay's instances, other engagements indicate that troops that remained on the defense had an advantage. Some of the most spectacular examples can be found in the 100 Years' War and the Hussite Wars. The Hussite troops were masters of the defensive. They repeatedly defeated superior forces of knights thanks to their wagon forts. They rarely took the attack, instead waiting until their opponents attacked, weakening them and unleashing a counterattack at the first sign of vulnerability. These examples suggest that de Bay was onto something, which is why most current historians feel the defensive side did really have an advantage. Clifford Rogers, for example, explored this extensively before in a paper back in 1996. Other tacticians have also observed this. For example, Karl von Clausewitz wrote, "As we shall prove, defense is a greater type of warfare than attack. But why was it so advantageous to remain on the defensive in the first place?" 2 variables were decisive. Usually, the defending side had control of the battlefield. The defender could await the attacker in a favorable location, like on a hill, behind a bottleneck, or in front of swampy terrain. The advantage of choosing the battlefield was sometimes so enormous that the attackers saw no point in fighting, and instead aimed to entice the defenders into a more equal scenario or avoided the confrontation altogether. The second major advantage of playing defense was that it allowed forces to keep their position. Medieval infantry often fought in close formations because presenting a coherent front of spears to the opponent offered them the best chance in warfare. The problem was that soldiers who did not routinely exercise together found it tough to move in formation. Even the slightest hurdle could become an issue. Rivers, hills, or field fortifications were practically impenetrable, and even a shrub, a huge boulder, or oncoming fire could induce disorganization. And the implications of a disturbed formation were severe. Christine de Pizan, one of the first French female writers, explains them as follows. 2 great evils can follow from a disorganized formation. One is that the opponents can more readily break into it. The other is that the formations may be so packed that they cannot fight. Thus, it is vital to preserve a formation in ranks and tight and connected together like a wall. Contemporary records generally ascribe defeats to the disintegration of formations, as demonstrated with the French at the Battle of Agincourt. Both of Christine de Pisan's great evils occurred there. First, the muddy ground and the French cavalry caused the approaching soldiers to become disoriented, making them vulnerable to English arrows. Then, the 800 or so men fighting the English on the front line became stuck between the enemy and their allies. Standing, examining the battlefield now, it's easy to see why the wet conditions made the French assault so difficult in 1415. The rain that had fallen down prior to the conflict accumulated at the bottom of the slope, where the English had positioned themselves, turning the battlefield into a muddy bog. It significantly restricted the knight's ability to maneuver. Seeing the battlefield with your own, this truly gives you a fresh picture of what happened on that day in 1415.
During battles like Agincourt, medieval soldiers often found themselves stuck between the enemy and their own friends. Medieval authors occasionally refer to this unexpectedly prevalent phenomena as the press. Soldiers trapped in the press failed to fight owing of the overwhelming pressure. In other cases, they were even crushed to death. So, the essential conclusion from all this is that if an infantry formation marched toward the enemy, the probability of it sliding into disarray was very high, whereas an army that remained immobile could hold its structure effortlessly. If a formation slipped into disorder, it was at a considerable disadvantage compared to an ordered opponent, and the chances of defeat were great. As a result, the defending side had a distinct advantage. Of course, the troops and tacticians of the time understood this too. In practice, this imbalance between offense and defense led to attempts to put the opponent in a situation where they were compelled to take the initiative while remaining in a safe defense position. This begs the question of why medieval generals would risk an offensive war at all, considering that the attacker was at an inherent disadvantage. The answer may sound simple, but it's not. You cannot achieve an offensive purpose with a defensive strategy. To wage a successful offensive war and achieve their aims, attackers have to take to the offensive strategically while ensuring they kept the tactical defensive posture during actual engagements. Or, to put it more simply, the trick was to march into enemy territory, but get the defense to attack first. The big challenge then was how to accomplish this, given that the opposite side likewise knew that striking first would put it at a disadvantage. Medieval military leaders come up with answers that can be condensed into three categories.
Irritate the enemy by insulting his honor, to pressure the opponent by attacking an important city, or pressure the opponent by plundering. Attack on the enemy's honor. The first option was to irritate the enemy by attacking his honor, for example, by insulting or threatening him. The simplest and most usual method of such a provocation was to invade foreign territory. This physical crossing of borders was a challenge as plain as a hurled gauntlet. The territorial lord of the invaded territory had to react to safeguard his honor. From a military point of view, it was generally wiser to ignore the problem, but this also carried a substantial risk. When Edward III of England led an army into France for the first time in 1339, at the commencement of the 100 Years' War, Philip VI refrained from engaging the invading army. Although this was a sound decision militarily, many of his compatriots considered it cowardice, and Philip's reputation was severely damaged. Many French knights accused him of acting like a fox, renardi in French, calling him dishonorable and deceitful, and publicly showing their disapproval by wearing caps made of fox fur. They rejected a ruler who accepted such an insult with impunity. The effect of a provocation was reinforced by symbolic gestures. For example, in 1339, Edward III deliberately entered France on October 9th, the feast day of Saint Denis of Paris, the patron saint of the French monarchs. To ensure the enemy could not pretend ignorance of the challenge, he was informed by letter simultaneously. These letters could appear very polite on the surface while carrying a clear undertone of threat or insult. Their most important aim was to make it clear right from the outset that the attacker was prepared to give the defender an opportunity to restore his honor through battle. So they made it clear that it was up to the offended party to take the initiative, suggesting that the lord of the invaded area should abandon the tactical defense to protect his honor, despite being in a defensive position. Henry of Grosmont, the first Duke of Lancaster, formulated such a message as follows. My lord answered that he had come into these parts in order to do certain business, which he had now well completed, thanks be to God, and was now returning from where he had done it. And if the said King Jean of France wanted to disturb Haim in his way, he would be ready to meet him. The problem with provocations was that they only worked if the offended ruler's sense of honor caused him to ignore the voice of reason. Rulers who managed to keep their cool would usually maintain their advantageous defensive position. Therefore, the attackers tried to frame challenges in a way that refusal would cause the greatest damage to their enemy's honor, such as by portraying him as a coward. A cleverly worded letter left the defender little choice but to react, as adopting a passive stance could do more harm than fighting a battle from a poor position. Siege as leverage. The second option was to pressure the enemy by besieging a symbolically or economically important city. The threat of losing a center of economy and power forced the defender to go on the offensive. Abandoning the city or waiting too long to relieve it could be interpreted as a failure to fulfill his duty as a ruler, or simply incompetence. For their part, the besiegers had all the time in the world and could wait for the anticipated attack in a position of their choice. This approach was used by Edward III when he besieged Berwick in 1333. The siege forced the Scots to abandon their strong position and attack his troops at Halidon Hill. They had to approach the English across a marsh and were mercilessly shot down by their longbowmen. Putting pressure on an enemy in this way was expensive and time-consuming. Important cities were usually well fortified, and the maneuver only worked if the attacker succeeded in bringing the city to its knees. Only when the garrison's situation became dire and the city was on the verge of being conquered did the pressure to come to its aid intensify. It was only then that it became worthwhile for our ruler to take the risk of attacking a besieging force. Henry V had to besiege the French town of Rouen for over 6 months until this point was reached. 6 months that cost him a great deal, and were almost as arduous for his men as they were for the people in the city. Much to his chagrin, he then discovered that in some cases, a sovereign preferred to give up a city rather than risk a battle. The French did raise an army to liberate Rouen, but ultimately decided not to attack. Pushing an opponent onto the offensive in this way required a certain amount of sensitivity. Sometimes, pressure alone was not enough. When Edward III laid siege to Calais, Philip VI did not want to risk a battle, even though the city was strategically critical and on the verge of capitulation. Edward then tried to lure him out of cover by offering to fight on a battlefield chosen by a committee of knights from both sides. Philip refused because he knew that even on an open field, he would be the one under pressure to attack and bring about a decision. As a result, he would still have had to take the offensive, leading to an unfair battle. This example aptly illustrates the interplay between strategic war aims and tactical necessity. Strategically, Edward needed a battle to achieve his goals. Tactically, he wanted to fight it on the defensive at all costs. To achieve both objectives, he was even willing to give up his strong position. Philip, on the other hand, made the only sensible decision from a tactical point of view, not accepting the offer. Plundering as leverage. The third way to get a defending army to take the initiative was plundering. One of the most important methods of warfare in the Middle Ages was the chevauchée, where mounted units plundered the enemy's territory. These raids were very efficient because they not only destroyed the enemy's resources, but also appropriated them for the attacker's cause. Most importantly, the population and economy of the area suffered, which created political pressure on the ruler. At some point, this pressure was so great that he either had to give in to the attacker's demands or confront them in battle. This was the case, for example, at the Battle of Crécy. When Edward III's troops plundered France in 1346, Philip VI marched against them. The English retreated to the north, bypassed a blockade at the river Somme, and awaited their pursuers on a battlefield where they had a clear advantage. Philip attacked anyway, and the English longbowmen shot several waves of his Genoese crossbowmen and French knights to pieces. Edward had managed to get the French to take the tactical initiative. They went on the offensive and lost the battle. Of course, the side on the defensive did not always win. There were numerous other decisive factors. However, the advantage of the tactical defense was so great that it was an important part of medieval warfare to try to put the other side in an offensive position. The attacker aimed to create a situation where the defender was forced to act by violating his honor, threatening a city, or inflicting lasting damage to the economy and reputation of the sovereign through plundering. The defender sought to prevent this. He wanted the attacker to take the offensive tactically to achieve his goals. In many cases, this was the more challenging task, because the defender had to endure plundering and losses until the attacker gave up his plan or took the tactical initiative. Invaders usually only did this if they ran out of supplies or something else forced their hand. If a defender held out long enough, every invader would eventually defeat himself, but holding out wasn't easy. The back and forth between offense and defense was a core element of medieval warfare. Therefore, Jean de Bouet was at least partly right. Putting yourself in a tactically defensive position or forcing your opponent in an offensive position was decisive for your chances in battle, and not only in the 100 Years' War. The imbalance between offense and defense played an essential role in the thinking of great tacticians, like Karl von Clausewitz, throughout history. The Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote as early as 500 BC, "Invincibility lies in the defense, the possibility of victory in the attack."